June 21st, 2026, 11:47 p.m. local time. 4 Storm Shadow cruise missiles leave the weapons pylons of modified Ukrainian Co-24M aircraft, operating at the edge of viable launch range over the Gulf of Finland approach corridor. Each missile weighs 1,300 kilograms. Each carries a 450-kilogram BROACH tandem warhead, built to defeat hardened infrastructure, reinforced concrete, buried pipe networks, steel-lined storage chambers. Their target, the Kronshtadt fuel distribution terminal on Kotlin Island, 30 kilometers west of St. Petersburg. The terminal serves the Baltic Fleet. The Su-24M crews bank hard and descend immediately, hugging the radar floor, already running for home. They will not see what happens next. The fires at Kronshtadt burn for 19 hours and 43 minutes. Satellite imagery released 36 hours later shows a terminal that no longer functions. Baltic Fleet patrol vessels scramble for Baltisk, 900 kilometers to the west, in what Russian Naval Command will later describe, in internal communications intercepted by Ukrainian signals intelligence, as an emergency redistribution. Ukraine just reached inside Russia's second city, on the most politically sensitive night of the Russian calendar in 2026, and they did it by watching the air defense network breathe. I'm your host at SteelFront, where we analyze the battles that change wars. This is the story of how Ukrainian GER strike planners spent 6 weeks mapping a 40-minute window of Russian vulnerability and turned it into one of the most consequential long-range strikes of the entire conflict. The Kronshtadt strike did not begin with the launch order. It began in late April 2026, inside a GER planning cell that had been watching something most Western analysts missed. Russian air defense posture around St. Petersburg follows a pattern. That pattern creates a window. The planners found it. What they did with it is what we're breaking down today. The intelligence, the timing, the 4 missiles, and the strategic message that echoed far beyond the burning fuel tanks on Kotlin Island. St. Petersburg is not a frontline city. It sits 700 kilometers from the nearest active combat zone. As of June 2026, Russia has treated it as untouchable, a showcase city, the cultural capital, the home of the Baltic Fleet's primary Western support infrastructure. That sense of untouchability is itself a vulnerability. Complacency breeds routine. Routine creates patterns. Patterns can be exploited. The Kronshtadt naval fortress sits on Kotlin Island, at the eastern mouth of the Gulf of Finland. It is operationally critical. The fuel distribution terminal there serves a specific and irreplaceable function. It is the primary bunkering facility for Baltic Fleet surface combatants operating in the Eastern Gulf, and it feeds the forward airfield fuel pipelines serving Russian air assets along the Finnish border and the Karelian Isthmus. Destroy it, and you do not just damage a fuel depot. You force an entire logistical chain to reroute through facilities never designed to carry the load. You buy disruption, and if you do it on the right night, you send a message that no press release or drone video could match. The Kremlin had scheduled a major ceremonial event for June 21st, 2026. The specifics of the event do not matter for this analysis. What matters is the security posture it triggered. Russian protocol for regime protection events involves the temporary reorientation of air defense assets away from peripheral coverage zones toward core regime protection corridors. Moscow and the Kremlin complex receive additional layering. Key transport and communication nodes along the M11 highway corridor receive heightened radar coverage. Assets that would normally be covering the St. Petersburg approach from the southwest, the Gulf of Finland entry corridor, get tasked to secondary positions. Their coverage arcs rotated, their refresh cycles lengthened. Ukrainian GER analysts had documented this pattern across 4 previous major events between October 2025 and May 2026. Each time Russia staged a significant ceremonial event, the same reorientation occurred. Not identical each time, the Russians were not completely oblivious, but consistent enough to define a window. The window lasted between 35 and 50 minutes. 40 minutes was the conservative planning figure. 40 minutes was enough. Which weapon delivered the decisive blow at Kronshtadt? Was it the Storm Shadow missiles themselves? Was it the 6 weeks of patient intelligence collection that made the launch window possible? Or was it the analysts who spotted the pattern in Russian air defense behavior? Comment below. A. The missiles. B. The intelligence. C. The timing. Because the answer reveals something important about how Ukraine fights this war. The Su-24M Fencer is a Soviet-era swing-wing strike aircraft, not a stealth platform, not a fifth-generation fighter. In its original configuration, it was never meant to carry Western precision cruise missiles. Ukrainian defense engineers have spent years modifying these airframes, reinforcing pylon hardpoints, integrating Western fire control interfaces, adjusting electronic systems to communicate with Storm Shadow's onboard navigation suite. The result is a platform that looks obsolete on the ramp and executes precision strategic strikes in the field. That gap between appearance and capability is a recurring theme in how Ukraine wages this war. Storm Shadow, designated Scalp EG in French service, is a British-French long-range air-launched cruise missile with a declared range of over 250 kilometers, though operational employment patterns suggest effective strike range in some configurations exceeds that figure. The missile uses terrain-referenced navigation, GPS guidance, and an infrared terminal seeker to identify and strike specific aim points on a target structure. Its BROACH warhead is a 2-stage penetrating system. The first charge blasts through reinforced surfaces. The second detonates inside the structure for maximum internal damage. Against a fuel terminal, a complex of above-ground storage tanks, underground pipe networks, loading infrastructure, and control systems, a direct hit does not just destroy the point of impact, it creates cascading failure throughout the connected system. 4 missiles, 4 aim points, each selected as part of a structured damage framework designed by GUR, targeting analysts working with satellite imagery, commercial reconnaissance data, and OSINT mapping of the terminal's functional architecture. The primary tank farm held the largest volume of marine diesel and aviation fuel. The loading pier infrastructure controlled the physical transfer of fuel to vessels at dock. Destroy both, and you do not need to hit every tank. You make the terminal non-functional as a distribution node, even if individual storage elements survive. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 20 minutes of this operation breaks down a chain of decisions that destroyed a critical Russian logistics hub, while most of the world was watching a different screen entirely. The launch window opened at 11:31 p.m. on June 21, 2026. Ukrainian signals intelligence confirmed the expected reorientation of Russian air defense coverage had begun approximately 40 minutes earlier, consistent with prior pattern analysis. The Pantsir S-1 battery, covering the southwestern approach to Kronshtadt from Lomonosov, had shifted its search radar to a northeasterly orientation. The S-400 battalion at Gachina, which provides long-range coverage of the Gulf of Finland entry corridor, showed reduced tracking activity on its engagement radar, consistent with a system in standby rather than active search mode. The coverage gap was opening exactly as predicted. The GUR strike cell issued the execute authorization at 11:34 p.m. The Su-24Ms, holding at altitude near the edge of validated Russian SAM engagement envelopes over the eastern Gulf of Finland, began their attack runs. At ranges of approximately 250 to 280 kilometers from Kronshtadt, the missiles were released in 2 pairs, with a staggered interval of approximately 90 seconds between pairs. This staggering was deliberate, designed to complicate any reactive air defense engagement by presenting sequential rather than simultaneous tracks, forcing radar operators to prioritize and potentially saturate response capacity. The first pair of Storm Shadows descended from launch altitude and transitioned to low-altitude terrain following flight, dropping to cruise altitudes that exploit the radar shadow created by the Gulf's coastal terrain features and the island geography around Kotlin. At cruise speed, approximately 1,000 kilometers per hour, the missiles covered the remaining distance in under 15 minutes. The second pair followed on a slightly offset flight path, approaching from a marginally different bearing to complicate fire control solutions. Going through the available OSINT mapping of Kronstadt's defensive architecture, one detail kept standing out. The Pantsir S-1 battery, positioned to cover the terminal approach, was not the primary air defense asset for Kotlin Island. It was a secondary layer, a point defense system, installed to catch anything that leaked through the outer coverage. The outer coverage had been rotated away for the ceremonial event. That meant the Pantsir was being asked to serve as both outer and inner layer simultaneously. That is not what Pantsir is designed to do. Most people assume Russian air defense forms a seamless, overlapping dome of protection. The evidence, from HIMARS strikes in 2025 to the Black Sea drone campaigns to this strike, tells a different story. Russian air defense is layered but not seamless. The layers depend on each other. Remove one, and the gaps that appear are larger than the individual system's coverage footprint suggests, because the overlapping arcs were doing work that neither system could do alone. The Pantsir S-1 battery engaged. Radar acquisition occurred at approximately 42 kilometers from the terminal. The crew brought the system to full engagement mode and fired. One Storm Shadow was intercepted, the trailing missile of the second pair, caught at the outer edge of the Pantsir's engagement envelope, at approximately 31 kilometers range. The intercept was confirmed by debris pattern analysis and subsequent Russian statements, which acknowledged one interception while attempting to claim all four had been stopped. Satellite imagery settled that argument. The first pair of missiles arrived at the main tank farm at 11:47 p.m. Impact 1 struck the primary storage cluster. 3 interconnected above-ground tanks holding marine diesel, designated for Baltic Fleet surface combatants, scheduled for refueling operations over the following 72 hours. The BROACH warhead penetrated the tank wall and detonated internally. The resulting fireball was visible from the Finnish coast. Impact 2 struck a secondary tank farm section containing aviation fuel stocks for the forward airfield pipeline network. The fuel-air mixture above partially filled tanks created a secondary explosion that exceeded the initial blast in visible energy release. By midnight, the terminal's internal firefighting suppression systems had been overwhelmed. The third missile, the leading element of the second pair, struck the loading pier infrastructure at 11:48 p.m. The pier complex at Kronshtadt handles not just fuel transfer, but also ammunition resupply and general logistics for Baltic Fleet vessels cycling through the base. The strike hit the fuel transfer manifold system, the network of pipes, valves, and pumping infrastructure that controls the flow of fuel from terminal to vessel. Destroy the manifold, and the tanks that survive the first 2 strikes become irrelevant. You cannot move the fuel even if you still have it. 3 missiles, 3 strikes, 1 interception, fires burning across the entire terminal complex. The Pantsir crew had performed exactly as well as could be expected given the circumstances. They acquired, tracked, and intercepted a supersonic cruise missile under degraded outer defense conditions. Technically competent, also insufficient. Here is the part of this analysis that should generate debate. The Russian decision to reduce outer coverage around Kronshtadt for a ceremonial event in Moscow was a command-level failure, not a tactical-level one. The Pantsir crew did their job. The generals who rotated their coverage arcs did not do theirs. Here is the take that will probably generate some pushback. The Kronshtadt strike should not be analyzed primarily as a logistics success, even though the logistics impact was significant. It should be analyzed as an intelligence and planning victory that exposed something fundamental about how Russia allocates air defense resources when regime protection priorities conflict with perimeter security. Every ceremonial event creates this tension. Ukraine demonstrated it can exploit that tension at will, at range, and with precision. The question the Russian General Staff has to answer after Kronshtadt is not how to replace the fuel terminal. It is how to prevent Ukraine from doing this again, on any night of Russia's choosing. Subscribe to SteelFront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because the lessons from Kronshtadt are not just tactical, they are architectural. The fires burned through the night of June 21 and all of June 22. Russian emergency response services deployed to Kotlin Island, but faced immediate complications. The Kronshtadt road causeway was operational, but fuel debris in the harbor complicated maritime firefighting support. and the intensity of the burning fuel created heat zones that limited ground-based approach. The Leningrad Oblast Emergency Services requested federal reinforcement at approximately 3:30 a.m. on June 22nd. The fires were not fully suppressed until 7:30 a.m. on June 23, 19 hours and 43 minutes after the first impact. Russian state media initially ran a story stating that Ukrainian drones had been intercepted over St. Petersburg and that there was no damage to critical infrastructure. This statement was issued at approximately 1:15 a.m. on June 22nd, while the fires were visible from civilian residential areas across the bay. Social media footage from Kronshtadt residents documented the blaze in real time. The state media denial lasted approximately 14 hours before the official line shifted to acknowledging a strike, but minimizing its significance. Satellite imagery from commercial providers, analyzed and published by multiple OSINT tracking organizations by the afternoon of June 23rd, showed the terminal's main tank farm had been completely destroyed. The loading pier infrastructure showed severe structural damage to the manifold systems. 2 auxiliary storage structures had experienced secondary ignition and burned independently. Total estimated storage capacity destroyed: approximately 8,400 metric tons of marine diesel and 2,100 metric tons of aviation fuel. Replacement timeline for comparable terminal infrastructure, per independent infrastructure analysis: 6 to 9 months minimum, under normal construction conditions. The operational impact was immediate. Baltic Fleet patrol vessels docked at Kronshtadt at the time of the strike. 3 Staragushchi-class corvettes and 1 Karakurt-class missile corvette could not complete their scheduled refueling cycle. They were redirected to Baltisk, the Baltic Fleet's primary western base in the Kaliningrad exclave, approximately 900 kilometers by sea transit. The redirection disrupted scheduled patrol rotations in the eastern Gulf of Finland for 2 weeks, creating a patrol gap that Swedish and Finnish maritime surveillance assets documented extensively. The aviation fuel pipeline serving forward airfields on the Karelian Isthmus experienced an immediate supply interruption. Those airfields, supporting Russian air patrol operations over the Gulf, and reconnaissance missions monitoring Finnish and Swedish naval activity since their NATO accession, were forced to rely on truck-delivered fuel, a slower, higher-cost delivery method that reduced sortie generation rates at affected bases by an estimated 30 to 40% for the first 10 days following the strike. Put yourself in the position of the Russian Baltic Fleet commander on the morning of June 22, 2026. 3 corvettes rerouting to Baltisk, forward airfields running on truck fuel, a terminal that will take the better part of a year to rebuild. And you have to write an assessment to Moscow explaining how this happened, while a major ceremonial event was being staged, and every television camera in Russia was pointed the other way. That assessment, whatever it contained, did not change the damage. It did not unburn the fuel tanks. It did not put the pier manifold back together. What it represented was the formal acknowledgement that Russia's second city had been reached, and that the window had been found, used, and documented. How many total fuel storage structures were destroyed or damaged at Kronshtadt? A, 3, B, 5, C, 7. The answer, and what it reveals about the strike's actual targeting logic, is coming at the end of this analysis. Ukrainian reaction was measured but deliberate. The GUR did not immediately claim the strike publicly, standard operating procedure that maintains ambiguity and forces Russian information management into reactive mode. Anonymous Ukrainian official sources, speaking to Western journalists over the following 36 hours, confirmed Ukrainian responsibility in terms that were carefully calibrated, acknowledging the operation's success, attributing it to Ukrainian long-range strike capability, and specifically noting the timing relative to the Russian ceremonial event. That last detail was the message within the message. It was not accidental, it was the point. What stands out about this operation is that it reflects a maturity of Ukrainian strategic strike planning that goes beyond weapon systems. Many militaries can fire a cruise missile given access to the platform. Very few can execute a strike that is simultaneously a logistics attack, a timing statement, a credibility demonstration, and a message about the limits of Russian air defense, all in a single 4-missile salvo. That kind of planning synthesis is not improvised. It is built over years of operational learning. Ukraine has been developing this long-range precision strike competency since the first Storm Shadow deliveries in 2023. The Crimean Bridge strikes, the Black Sea Fleet operations, the Kerch Strait attacks, the multiple strikes against Russian logistics infrastructure deep in occupied territory. Each contributed to an institutional understanding of how to plan, time, and execute strikes against hardened targets inside defended airspace. Kronshtadt represents the current apex of that learning curve, and the curve is still rising. If you believe modern warfare is ultimately decided by institutional learning speed, how fast an organization converts battlefield experience into improved capability, comment yes. If you think hardware advantage still dominates, comment NO. Because the Kronshtadt strike is a direct argument for the former, and the evidence is in the crater pattern. One obstacle nearly complicated the operation before it launched. Ukrainian SIGINT monitoring of Russian air defense network traffic on June 20, the day before the planned launch window, showed anomalous radar activity near the Primorsk coastal defense sector, suggesting possible unscheduled repositioning of a mobile radar asset. If the repositioning was significant, it could have partially filled the coverage gap that the ceremonial event was expected to create. The strike cell had a 12-hour hold window built into the operational plan. The decision to proceed or stand down was made at approximately 8 p.m. on June 21st, after updated SIGINT confirmed the Primorsk activity was routine maintenance rather than repositioning. The window was confirmed open. The execute authorization followed 3 hours and 34 minutes later. That 12-hour hold decision is worth dwelling on. Ukrainian strike planning in 2026 has developed a patience that mirrors the patience that made the intelligence collection phase possible. 6 weeks of pattern mapping, 12 hours of pre-launch verification, a 4-missile salvo delivered in a 40-minute window. The ratio of preparation to execution time is extraordinary. It reflects a doctrinal shift. Ukraine does not strike when it can strike. It strikes when the conditions for success are confirmed. That discipline is what separates successful long-range strikes from costly failures. The weapons used at Kronshtadt were British supplied. Storm Shadow was delivered to Ukraine beginning in 2023, making the UK one of the earliest suppliers of long-range cruise missile capability to Ukrainian forces. The United States provided critical intelligence support infrastructure, satellite reconnaissance, signals intelligence sharing through NATO frameworks, and likely precision targeting data that enhanced aim point selection. French Scalp EG missiles, functionally equivalent to Storm Shadow, have supplemented Ukrainian long-range strike capacity. The multinational intelligence and weapons supply chain behind a 4-missile strike on a Russian naval logistics hub is itself a statement about how Western defense cooperation has evolved since February 2022. There is a detail in this operation that stuck with me through the entire research process. The Russian Pantsir crew that intercepted Missile 4 did so in the final seconds of a viable engagement window, at the outer edge of their effective range, under conditions that were tactically unfavorable. Rotated outer coverage, degraded radar coordination, no backup from the S-400 system at Gachina. They intercepted one, in a different configuration of the salvo, with a slightly different approach geometry. That interception might not have happened either. The Pantsir crew did their job under impossible conditions, created by decisions made far above their pay grade. That is a different kind of story than the one Russian state media told. If you believe tactical decisions should be evaluated separately from strategic ones, that you can perform well at one level while failing at another, type SteelFront in the comments. Because the Kronshtadt strike is a textbook example of that exact dynamic. Russian internal response, based on intercepted communications and subsequent observable behavior changes, showed 3 parallel tracks developing in the days after the strike. First, an accelerated review of air defense coverage protocols during regime protection events, specifically whether ceremonial security posture should come at the cost of peripheral coverage, or whether additional assets should be surged to maintain both simultaneously. Second, emergency procurement inquiries for mobile fuel distribution assets, capable of supporting Baltic Fleet operations from dispersed sites, rather than a single centralized terminal. Third, a visible shift in public communications posture, a pivot from outright denial to a narrative of minimization, combined with accelerated counter-messaging about Russian air defense effectiveness in other theaters. None of these responses undid the damage. The terminal remained offline through the remainder of June 2026. Baltic Fleet operational tempo in the eastern Gulf of Finland remained below pre-strike levels. The aviation fuel supply chain for Karelian Isthmus airfields continued operating on truck delivery through mid-July, per open-source monitoring. What would NATO have done differently if NATO forces had been planning this strike? Comment your analysis, because the planning and execution visible in the Kronshtadt operation has raised that question in Western military circles. The combination of pattern-mapped intelligence collection, window-timed launch execution, structured damage framework targeting, and deliberate signal management in the aftermath looks less like improvised adaptation and more like mature operational planning doctrine. Where that doctrine came from, how much represents Ukrainian innovation, how much reflects direct NATO operational advising, how much is simply the product of 3+ years of high-intensity warfare experience, is a question that analysts in multiple capitals are actively working through. The one thing that is not a question: the strike worked. The strategic ledger for the Kronshtadt strike looks like this. Ukrainian losses: 0 aircraft, 0 crews, 3 Storm Shadow missiles expended in successful strikes, 1 expended in an intercepted strike. Russian losses: primary fuel terminal non-operational for an estimated 6 to 9 months, approximately 10,500 metric tons of fuel stocks destroyed, loading pier infrastructure severely damaged, Baltic Fleet patrol rotation disrupted for 2 weeks, forward airfield sortie generation reduced for 10 days, and, hardest to quantify but perhaps most significant, the demonstrated vulnerability of a prestige city on a politically loaded night. The value of the destroyed infrastructure, including fuel stocks and terminal reconstruction costs, has been estimated by independent analysts at between $180 and $230 million. The operational disruption value, reduced patrol coverage, reduced air sortie generation, logistics chain rerouting costs, adds further to that figure. Against the cost of 3 Storm Shadow missiles and the operational costs of the Cu-24M mission, the return on investment is not close. Real tactics, real consequences. SteelFront. Here is the quiz answer you have been waiting for. How many total fuel storage structures were destroyed or damaged at Kronshtadt? The answer is B, 5. The 2 primary tank farm structures struck directly by missiles 1 and 2 were destroyed. The aviation fuel storage section, struck by Missile 2, also caused secondary ignition in 2 adjacent auxiliary storage structures. Not primary aim points, but close enough to experience thermal cascade failure. A 5th structure, a smaller lubricant and hydraulic fluid storage building near the loading pier, was damaged by the pier strike's overpressure wave and debris scatter. The strike's declared aim point architecture targeted 3 structures. The actual damage footprint covered 5. That is not an accident of physics. It is the product of aim point selection that accounted for secondary effects. The GUR targeting analysts understood the terminal's layout well enough to predict cascade damage. That level of targeting detail does not come from satellite imagery alone. It comes from a comprehensive intelligence picture assembled over time. Was the decision to strike on the night of the ceremonial event the right tactical choice? Some would argue it created maximum exposure risk. If anything had gone wrong, the political blowback during a high-visibility Russian event would have been acute. Others would argue the timing was precisely what made the operation viable and gave it strategic resonance beyond its tactical impact. Where you land on that question says something about how you think about risk tolerance in offensive operations. Could Russian air defense have prevented the Kronshtadt strike? Not with the coverage configuration deployed on June 21, 2026, with a different resource allocation decision, maintaining full coverage of peripheral approaches even during ceremonial events, at the cost of reduced protection redundancy over regime sites. The probability of successful intercept would have risen significantly. That is a solvable problem, at least in theory. The question is whether Russia has the assets to solve it without accepting coverage gaps somewhere else, on an already overextended defensive network. What would you have done differently if you were the GUR strike cell commander? The timing, the number of missiles, the aim point selection, the staggered launch geometry. Each was a decision made under real constraints with real consequences. Drop your analysis in the comments. We read every serious tactical breakdown. Subscribe to SteelFront, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. In modern warfare, the gap between understanding and not understanding is the difference between a defended position and a burning terminal. Ukraine's long-range strike program is writing new chapters of military doctrine in real time, and you should understand what those chapters say. There is also something coming in our next analysis that connects directly to what happened at Kronshtadt, a pattern in how Ukraine has been systematically mapping Russian logistical vulnerabilities across multiple theaters simultaneously, creating a strategic targeting architecture that goes well beyond individual strikes. That analysis will change how you read every Ukrainian long-range strike you hear about going forward. The Kronshtadt fuel terminal is quiet now. The fires are out. The tankers that were docked there have been gone for days. The island sits in the Gulf of Finland the way it has for 3 centuries. Fortified, gray, surrounded by water that has seen more naval history than almost any other stretch of sea in Europe. But the wrecked infrastructure remains. The burned-out tank farm remains. The damaged pier remains. Modern warfare punishes command-level mistakes without mercy and rewards patient, precise, intelligence-driven planning, with results that extend far beyond the strike itself. The window was 40 minutes. Ukraine found it, used it, and made it count. Stay vigilant.